And Jim, former exec with the Mets, the Orioles, former GM, and now with SiriusXM MLB Radio, joins us here on Willard and Dibs. Hey, Jim, how are you?
What's up, guys? Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Talking to him the other day, and expecting to upgrade as you get closer to the deadline, which I would expect as well with the Giants. That listen, the one thing, as you guys have seen, the National League postseason picture right now, the bar is pretty low. There's only 7 teams that have 30 wins. Giants are one of them.
Yeah. I mean, that's the situation. And Jim, it's so early with regard to the deadline, but when a team is waiting for homegrown talent and there's finally starting to get some, how do you weigh that? Because obviously being aggressive at the deadline usually means giving some of that young talent up.
Yeah, it does. And I think a lot of it, is going to be dependent too on who's available, the type of quality that's available, right? And you might, and if I'm Farhan, I'm probably saying a couple guys are off limits. I'm not moving them, and that affects who you can get. Harrison's a guy. I've seen Harrison, and I would not want to give that kid up. He's going to be a big part of the future for the Giants. So, that's the thing that I think if you're in Farhan's shoes, you don't, you kind of go through and you let the other teams know, hey, I'm not going to give up, these 3 guys. And, you end up biting the bullet sometimes and saying, well, in a certain circumstance, we can get a controllable pitcher. Maybe we do it, but I don't see that controllable pitcher going to be available at the deadline. I think there's going to be a couple of what I would say, 3-month rentals.
Is it more tempting for a player or for a guy in Farhan's spot, knowing that with 6 playoff teams and a National League that is pretty bottom weak and kind of middle heavy, does it make you more apt to try to act at the deadline?
That's a good question. I would say this, because it is, the gap between, I would say Atlanta's the best team right now in the National League, and then, you can throw Arizona, Dodgers, from there, there's a toss-up. I think there's a drop-off at the moment. I think it's going to get better as the summer goes on. But when you're at the deadline and you see that you're within striking distance, the GM can make a difference. And we've seen it over the last several years of making a trade where you go out and get a guy that, ends up being, the deciding factor in the division or in the postseason. So, it is really tempting to, because and here's the thing. I've always felt this way, even when I was in the front office, and it's been a while since I've been there, but you see even now, you almost have to make a move these days if you're in it. The players are fighting their tail off for you, and they hold you accountable. And we've seen it in a couple instances where even in Houston, that first World Series they won, they traded for Verlander. They didn't trade for anybody at the deadline, and a couple of the players called out the GM, and then all of a sudden here comes Verlander at the end of the month. So, more times than not, you hear the players, griping if you don't do something. So there's extra pressure, I think, for the GM.
Jim Duquette, former GM of the Mets, now SiriusXM MLB Radio, is our guest here. Willard and Dibs, 95.7 The Game. All right, Jim, what would you offer Shohei Ohtani?
Well, we know there's a certain number that he is going to be looking at, and I think it's his teammates right now. Mike Trout's number, that's the number that's the biggest at the moment. I think it's 426, 420. It's in that range. I should know it off the top of my head, but I got a bunch of numbers I'm trying to remember, and that's one of them that he's going to surpass. And so then the question is, how far above that is it going to be? I don't believe it's going to be 500. But there's a lot of people that do. And here's the thing. It's hard to deny that it could get there, because I think the Giants are going to be in on them. Dodgers, Mets, Angels, who knows about the Padres? They spend money like they've got a ton of it, and that they can't be buried with it. The owner's like, I can't take it with me, so he spends like going out of style. So, maybe even the Yankees. So I guess at the end I wouldn't rule it out. But right now I feel like, being above that or setting the record Ohtani's going to have 4 or 5 different teams that he can go and choose from.
If you were in Farhan's seat, and I know that you're not, but he's in a spot where he missed out on Judge, who's now heading to the IL, and he missed out on Bryce Harper, and that's been hit and miss, and he missed out on Carlos Correa, and boy, that turns out to be a good miss, quote unquote. Would you advise ownership that maybe it's better to stay the course and try to develop from within as opposed to what might be fool's gold with these high-priced guys?
Most of these don't end well. I mean, if you just look at it over time, and even the future Hall of Famers, Pujols' last couple years did not end well. The Angels cut bait there. Miggy, Miguel Cabrera, that has not ended well and has not aged well. Robinson Cano, you could go through the majority of them, but there's also a cost of doing business. And finding, that superstar player. Here's the thing I've always said, and even when I was there in the front office, when they're paying that kind of money, they're not, obviously, in age 39, 40, 41, or whatever it is that they're going to end up paying through. You have to look at that as deferred compensation only. They're not, teams know they're not going to be productive in that sense. So it really becomes an ownership decision. Are you willing to go there? If I was the GM, I would try to pass on most of those guys. But, you have to be willing to take the grief. And it's a huge PR hit. And sometimes it ends up, you end up not having a very good team. And that's the challenge in these things. That's what the Padres are even facing. They signed a bunch of guys. Look where they are right now. They're under 500. So, it's difficult. There's a lot of pressure on those guys to perform. There's pressure in the front office to do them. My general feeling has been, man, it's too much money to be spending on guys anyway, but then you don't end up with a player, and boy, if you don't have any other options, sometimes it forces you to do things you don't want.
You know what? It's interesting what you're saying, Jim, because I think it speaks to a lot of fans here in San Francisco. We look at who Farhan is and the way he does business, and it feels like he thinks the same way you do, which is that these are usually bad deals. Right. But are they coming from the GM or the owner? Let me throw it to you this way. You think Farhan's happy that the Correa thing fell through?
He is now. Yeah. Yeah. He is now. And you know what? You know who else is happy that it fell through and they could have gotten it for less money? The Mets. They're happy too. And so, and in the moment, I remember, I don't know if I came on your show, but I remember the outrage and holy, you got to be kidding me. The Giants, they can't close the deal. And yeah, you get questioned about your ability to land the big one and, are they ever going to attract, are they ever going to spend money? But at the end of the day, they're lucky they don't have Correa right now. And, you could say the same for Judge long term. I think Judge, will be back soon. And, he got injured crashing through a gate, it's like, okay, that's going to happen, but this guy's a beast right now, and one of the best players in the sport. But again, that's going to, 7, 8, 9 years from now, that's not going to age well either.
Do we reach a tipping point for these monster deals where they start becoming less frequent? Is the new wild card format going to be, I think, part of what ultimately moves teams to realize that if you get into the playoffs, even with a, quote, mediocre roster, you can still win a championship without spending $500 million.
Yeah, I keep wondering that, myself. Like, okay, and by the way, the Players Association thought that would be the case. Like, you add another wild card. They were concerned about the competitiveness of teams because the bar is lower, and like it's looking like right now, it made. Who knows? We might have an 84-win team. The way it's looking in the National League, we might have an 82-win team go to the postseason, and so that bar is lower, and teams are going to be less willing to spend money. Having said that, if you look at the money that was spent this winter, it didn't stop teams. So, and I asked Farhan that question, and that was asked on our show, and he even argued. He said, "Listen, I think in looking at it, it appeared like." Teams were willing to spend more, and historically, I think we've seen that coming out of new CBA agreements that teams have spent more. So, I thought, intuitively, you'd say, yeah, it doesn't. I don't think teams will spend money, but I think it showed this year anyway that that was not the case.
Jim Duquette, former Mets GM, with us here, Willard and Dibs. Jim, you said earlier that you've watched Kyle Harrison. What do you see?
I love the guy's stuff. I love his mound presence. There's everything about him. I think the command is kind of the last thing about it. That I think when we were talking to Farhan, he admitted it's not been quite what they expected. Having said that, command and control are kind of tricky things, right? You might not walk a lot of guys, but he is not able to command the pitch where he wants it yet. And even Farhan pointed to a game that he had seen recently where, he got to a good count, and then he ends up hitting a guy on a breaking ball. It was back foot breaking ball. Hit a guy. A couple of tough pitches that were borderline calls that were challenged that he didn't get the call that would have been called strikes. Like the point is there are extenuating circumstances sometimes when you look at the numbers on the surface. You go, well, that doesn't look good, but the story might be different. So the point is he may not be that far away when it comes to the command of his stuff than what the numbers look. And that's what I felt like how Farhan was answering the question about his readiness or how quickly he might help.
Readiness is such a nebulous thing because any team is 2 wins away from being in it or 2 wins away from being out of it. In terms of the Giants' window to maybe be contenders, is it bigger and longer than most teams based on their youth?
I think that is a fair point. Yeah, I think every year, it's different, and get off to bad starts like you see with some of these teams, like the Cardinals in particular, and it's hard to dig out of, and so you sometimes have a step back. But I think generally speaking, yeah, if you're competitive and you're well rounded, and the thing I look about this team now, you got the 5 or 6 guys that are sitting there with OPSs over 800, and so you're not relying on 1 or 2 guys like some teams, like the Mets are right now. They've got 2 guys that are swinging the bat. Everyone else has been garbage. It's like, for me, those type of teams, and then you insert a couple of young guys. Yeah, you can have longevity, and so I think that with the way things are trending, and some of the production they've gotten out of Bailey and Schmidt and some of the other homegrown guys, that gives you payroll flexibility in that marketplace to make sure you're spending money in other places. And I think the Giants are going to spend money year in and year out. We've seen that. But it gives you that payroll flexibility to maybe extend on a Shohei or somebody like that.
Okay, that's what you just talked about there at the end, Jim. That's the rub here in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet you know that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So everybody's waiting for who's the big fish, when's the right time, how does it blend with the homegrown players based on these guys? You just mentioned Schmidt and Bailey. We know maybe there are some more coming. Logan Webb is already here and signed up. Like, what's the right timing of this? What should the fans be demanding of the next handful of months?
Well, here's the thing. I think with the Judge negotiation, all right, I don't think that was the exception. So what I mean by that is, okay, well, they made a run at the guy. He's a local guy, and he's one of the best players. So we're going to make a run at him. If we don't get him, then that's it moving forward. I think that by design, they signed Conforto to the shorter deal and Haniger to the shorter, some of these shorter deals that they signed guys to, Jock, so that they could have the payroll flexibility to add impact. I think most of the time, if you look at the World Series teams over the past dozen years, I've been at every World Series for SiriusXM covering it. We do a pre and a post game every year. I usually have one of the league championship series. Almost every one of those teams have a star player or 2. 1 or 2 of them are homegrown. 1 or 2 are signed from the outside. And it's not always the recipe, but for the most part it is. And you guys saw, those championships there. Most of those championships were homegrown there in San Francisco. It's been a little bit different here, probably since the Giants' last World Series.
No doubt about it. I think you got that keyed up there pretty good. Jim, hey, really great stuff, man. Thank you so much for coming on. Look forward to doing it again.
You got it. Anytime, guys. Talk to you soon.